I came to Ghost Hill Lake for the quiet, a rare kind of quiet, the kind where you don't just hear yourself think, you feel yourself. For someone like me, words have always been my compass, my solace. But after my last book of poetry slipped into oblivion, my words felt hollow, my mind a ghost town of meaning. So I sought out solitude, the kind you can only find in the wilderness. The lake called to me, a vast, dark mirror fringed by ancient pines that leaned together like conspirators. The locals whispered their warnings about strange happenings, but I waved them off. Haunted lakes? Please. The first night, parked at the edge of that still water, the quiet was unsettling. No breeze, no ripples, just a sheet of black glass reflecting the faintly clouded sky. I lit a fire, opened my notebook, and waited for inspiration. Darkness wraps the lake like a shroud, I murmured, testing the words. From across the water, a whisper returned. Darkness wraps the lake like a shroud. It wasn't an echo. Not really. The timing was wrong, deliberate, like something was thinking. I shrugged it off, a trick of the acoustics, the solitude getting to me. But when I spoke again, the voice came back, softer, curious. My voice warped, stretched, wrong. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it. The voice didn't just mimic anymore. It learned. Repeated my poetry, my idle musings, even the stray thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud. Words twisted, layered, crawling over each other in a discordant symphony. Then it said something new. Hello, it whispered, my voice dripping with mockery. The lake's surface rippled, though there was no wind. I froze, staring into the black, and for the first time I felt it. Something was watching me, listening. I stopped writing after that. Locked myself in the RV, curtains drawn, hoping the thing would lose interest. But it didn't. Every night it crept closer, repeating me, calling to me, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. On the fifth night I cracked. What do you want? I shouted into the suffocating darkness. The answer rose from the lake, calm and practiced. I want you. I ran back to the RV, but it followed. My voice, distorted and cruel, echoed from every direction, tapping at the windows, scratching at the door, demanding to be let in. By morning, the silence was unbearable. The engine miraculously started and I left without looking back. But as I drove away, the whispers didn't fade. My voice, no, its voice still lingers in my mind, repeating my words with perfect precision. And now, even as I tell this, my voice feels strange. Not quite mine. Did I escape Ghost Hill Lake? Or is that thing still here, wearing my face, waiting for the moment it decides to speak? October 12th, 1995. That's when it happened. I didn't see it coming. Who would? Life hits you fast, they say. But this was like getting blindsided by something you didn't even know existed. I'll try to tell it straight, but even now, the pieces don't fit together right. Back then, I worked for a shadowy division of the CIA. Nothing glamorous, no secret missions, no spy games. My role was quieter, murkier. We dealt with anomalies, the unexplainable, the kind of things that don't make the news but keep someone up at night. My buddy Frank Duncan got me into it after I left the Marines. Said I'd be a good fit, field savvy, low profile. The paycheck wasn't bad either. That October, I was sent to the Pacific Northwest, deep in the mountains. The assignment seemed straightforward. Silver Lake, they called it. Small, forgotten, surrounded by dense woods. The kind of place you'd think was picturesque until you heard the stories. People disappeared out there. Not many, but enough for the locals to go quiet when you asked about it. Duncan was supposed to meet me there, but true to form, he was late. Always had some excuse. Bad roads, no signal. I wasn't surprised. The ranger station by the lake was desolate. Just me, my truck, and the kind of stillness that gets under your skin. You know that feeling, like the air itself is watching you? The trail looped around the lake, nothing too rugged, so I decided to scout. I wasn't armed. No one thought this was anything more than a routine check. About a mile in, I passed some abandoned cabins, old summer retreats, now wrecked and empty. But the damage was strange, deliberate, almost methodical. It didn't feel random, like drifters or time had done it. It felt purposeful. That's when I first felt it, that itch at the back of my mind. Something was wrong here. I turned back, uneasy. When I got to the ranger station, Duncan's truck was there, parked next to mine. The door was open, keys in the ignition, but no Duncan. His gear was untouched. No note, no sign of where he'd gone. I called his name. Nothing. The radio? Static, typical for the area, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I started down a side trail, thinking he'd wandered off to mess with me. 10 minutes in, the woods went dead silent. No birds, no wind, just nothing. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was Duncan. A figure stood ahead, unmoving, watching. But as I got closer, my stomach turned. It wasn't him. Its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, its head too small. It moved, jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to its own body. And then it bolted, faster than anything I've ever seen. It didn't make a sound. I froze, staring into the trees where it had vanished. Then I heard it, a voice. Faint, but unmistakable. Duncan. I ran, crashing through branches, following the sound. His voice grew louder, desperate, but wrong. It wasn't quite him. When I found him, I wished I hadn't. He was slumped against a tree, chest ripped open, his face locked in a silent scream. No blood. Not a drop. Just torn apart. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then the rustling started again. That thing was back. I grabbed Duncan's radio and ran. Branches clawed at my face as I tore through the woods. I didn't look back. I could feel it chasing me, fast. Too fast. The clearing came out of nowhere, the ranger station ahead. I threw myself into my truck, fumbling the keys with shaking hands. The engine roared, and I tore down the road, never looking back. They didn't believe me. Duncan's death? Bear attack, they said. Case closed. They didn't even try to explain the rest. I filed my report, but it went nowhere. That's how it works. Silence is easier. I still see it in my mind. Duncan, that thing, the impossible silence of those woods. The locals called it a shan, whispered it like a curse. Maybe it's just a story. Maybe it isn't. All I know is I'm never going back. It started like any other RV trip, a chance to escape, to breathe, to reset. Crater Lake, cradled in the Cascade Mountains of southern Oregon, was a place I'd visited countless times. Its deep sapphire waters, hemmed by jagged cliffs, had always been a sanctuary. After my father's death just months ago, I needed that sanctuary more than ever. Arlo Grafton, my best friend since high school, came with me. Arlo, with his grizzly beard and stocky frame, looked like he belonged to the wilderness. His booming laugh and awful jokes were a balm in heavy times. We arrived mid-morning, setting up the RV beneath towering pines. The forest seemed alive, its whispers carried on the wind. Hours drifted by as we fished the tranquil waters. The serenity felt like a gift, until he showed up. The man emerged from the trees, a wiry face like a worn map. His eyes, vacant and unsettling, locked onto mine. Jared Huxley, he said, calling himself a traveler passing through. Something about him felt off, but we invited him to join us for dinner. Around the fire, Jared spun tales of his travels, mundane at first, but then his voice dropped, low and deliberate. People vanish out here, he said, eyes fixed on the flames. Hikers, campers, they just disappear. Arlo forced a chuckle. You believe that? Jared shrugged, his expression unreadable. Believe what you want. Just thought you should know. The words lingered, clinging to the night like smoke. By morning, Jared was gone. No trace, no camp. We figured he was just a drifter and moved on. Later, Arlo suggested a hike to the crater rim. The climb was brutal, but the view, Crater Lake, shimmering like a jewel, was breathtaking. Feeling adventurous, we took a lesser-used trail down. That's when things started to unravel. Halfway down, we stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. Tattered clothes draped the trees like morbid decorations. A rusted pot, a torn backpack. It all looked forgotten, left to rot. A chill crawled up my spine. We should go back, I whispered. Arlo nodded, but before we could move, a rustling sound came from the underbrush. Probably a deer, Arlo muttered, though his voice betrayed him. The rustling grew louder, closer. Our pace quickened as the forest seemed to close in around us. Then Arlo stopped cold, pointing at the ground. A human skull, half buried. Jesus, I breathed, my pulse hammering. We need to leave now, Arlo said, his face pale as ash. We ran, the oppressive forest pressing against us. By the time we reached the RV, we were drenched in sweat and terror. Night fell. The silence was suffocating. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the RV door. We froze. Arlo grabbed his hunting knife, hand trembling. Who is it? I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. The knocks came again, louder this time. Arlo gestured for me to stay back and flung the door open. No one was there. Then, crash! Something slammed against the back of the RV. Arlo peered out the window, but the darkness revealed nothing. Heavy footsteps pounded on the roof. We need to go, Arlo hissed. We grabbed what we could and bolted into the woods. The shadow seemed alive, suffocating us. Arlo tripped, crying out as blood seeped from his leg. Keep going, he urged, but I couldn't leave him. The footsteps followed, closer and closer. Finally, we broke through the tree line and onto a road. In the distance, a cabin's light flickered like salvation. We stumbled to it, pounding on the door. An elderly man answered, his shotgun ready. Come in, he said, bolting the door behind us. We tried to explain, our words tumbling over each other. The man, Mr. Langley, listened in grim silence. This area is not safe after dark, he said. I've heard stories, but nothing like this. Then the knocking returned. 3 deliberate knocks. Langley gripped his shotgun. Who's Xylence? Then a voice. Help me, please. It was Jared. Don't open it, Arlo pleaded, but Langley hesitated. Against our protests, he unlocked the door. Jared stumbled in, battered and terrified. They're coming, he rasped. They're coming for us. Before we could react, the door burst open. Men stormed in, shadowed figures radiating menace. They seized Jared, dragging him out as he screamed for mercy. We fought back, but they overpowered us. One leaned in close, his face scarred, his voice ice cold. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. Then they vanished into the woods. At dawn, Langley drove us to safety. The authorities were skeptical, but the evidence, the skull, Arlo's wound, spoke for itself. Jared was never found. Back home, the feeling of being watched never left. Crater Lake holds its secrets, and somewhere out there, those men still roam. It was supposed to be simple, a quick escape into the wild. Just me and Nate, venturing deep into the Pine Barrens. I'd obsessed over this place for years, devouring every account of its endless pines, shadow-choked bogs, and eerie ruins. Locals whispered warnings about staying after dark, but I wasn't chasing their legends. I craved the silence, the unspoiled isolation. Nate came along for his own reasons, maybe to drown out his heartbreak in beer and fresh air. Looking back, the unease should have been obvious from the start. The drive-in felt serene, deceptively so. Empty roads unfurled ahead, hemmed by woods so thick they seemed to drink the daylight. We parked in a clearing buried deep in the forest. The trees loomed like skeletal sentinels, their twisted branches forming a cage overhead. No birdsong, no rustling critters, just the faint murmur of wind threading through the pines. That night by the fire, I almost felt at peace, the flames licking away the noise of life. Nate, though, was his usual self, grinning, popping another beer, and mocking the folklore. Come on, Chris, he laughed, leaning back against a log. The Jersey Devil? A horse bat thing snatching people? You need to stop reading ghost stories. I didn't answer. Nate never did get it. The history, the weight of a place like this. The Barrens had secrets older than we could understand. It's not about belief, I said, staring into the fire. It's about listening. This place, it's seen things. Yeah, sure, Nate chuckled, swigging his beer. I'm here for the trees, not tall tales. But that night as the fire burned low, I heard it. A scream, distant, thin, but deliberate. It wasn't human. I froze, my heart lurching. Nate, did you hear that? Fox, he mumbled, already half asleep. Go to bed. But it didn't sound like a fox. It sounded like it wanted us to hear it. The next morning, Nate was crouched by the edge of the clearing, frowning. Hey, Chris, look at this. The tracks were impossibly large, deep hoofprints gouged into the soil, spaced too far apart for anything normal. Deer? Nate suggested weakly. No. I swallowed hard. Not a deer, something bigger. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice trembled. We hiked further in, trying to ignore the shifting forest around us. The trees seemed closer, their knotted limbs clawing at the sky. The air thickened, heavy with something unspoken. By the time we realized we'd lost the trail, the sun had already started to die. That night, the scream returned, closer, sharper. What the hell is that? Nate whispered, pale. The forest answered with deliberate footsteps, crunching through the underbrush. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking. The beam sliced through the dark and caught something at the edge. A shadow, massive and hunched, moved too quickly for any animal, too deliberately for any man. Nate, I whispered. Get in the RV. We barely made it, slamming the door behind us. The RV felt like paper against the thing outside. It circled, its steps slow and measured, scratches etched along the walls, its breath fogging the glass. We clutched knives, useless but better than empty hands, waiting for dawn that felt a lifetime away. When light came, the tracks were worse, clawed gouges that had dug deep, circling the RV. "Chris," Nate's voice cracked. "We're leaving, now." The RV wouldn't start. Panic clawed at us as we packed what we could and fled on foot. The woods seemed endless, every path looping into itself. The silence turned suffocating, broken only by that scream, closer each time. By the third night, it found us. The scratching came first, then the pounding, heavy, deliberate, as the RV shuddered under each blow. Nate yelled something from the back, but I couldn't move. My flashlight caught the window, and there it was. It filled the frame, left grotesque and otherworldly. Wings unfurled, eyes burning like molten coals. It stared, unblinking, as though deciding. Then it screamed. The sound ripped through the RV, a wail that didn't just echo, it burrowed. The walls bowed, the glass cracked, and just as quickly as it had come, it left. At dawn, we stumbled to a road, flagging down the first car we saw. We don't talk about the Barrens anymore, but late at night, I hear it sometimes, a faint scream that claws its way back to me. And I know it's still out there, waiting. I should have known better than to trust a Craigslist ad for a used RV. My name is Travis Hull, and growing up in the gritty shadows of Detroit taught me how to handle stray dogs and alley rats, not whatever lurks in the untamed woods of nowhere. I'm a mechanic, good with machines. People, not so much. When a buddy swore by the peace of camping, I thought, why not? A break from exhaust fumes and wrenches sounded nice. That's how I ended up driving to Pennsylvania to meet an old man desperate to sell his RV. His house? A rotting shell swallowed by trees, the kind you see in true crime shows. The RV wasn't much better, paint peeling, panels dented, and an engine more corpse than machine. But the price? Too good to pass up. The old man, though, his eyes kept darting to the forest, like he expected something to step out. He said little. I asked even less. The drive to Allegheny National Forest was uneventful, the road narrowing as the trees thickened. By the time night fell, the canopy had swallowed the sky, leaving me under a sea of cold, glittering stars. It was quiet, too quiet. No sirens, no engines, just the wind weaving through the trees like a secret it couldn't keep. The first night passed uneventfully, but the second was different. It started when the RV's engine refused to start. I'd been working on it all day. It should have roared to life, but now it just clicked. Frustration bled into unease as the hair on my neck stood on end. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods. Nothing but trees, swaying, watching. I went back inside, trying to shake it off with cheap noodles and a battered book. That's when I heard it, a low hum, deep and alive, seeping through the walls of the RV. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't natural. Annoyed, I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped out. The beam carved through the darkness, catching glimmers of movement between the trunks. Something big, it silhouetted, too long, too twisted. And then it stopped. It turned. I felt its gaze. A chill running fingers down my spine. The flashlight flickered. For just a moment, I saw it. Black fur, slick like oil. Limbs spider thin and impossibly bent. Flesh glinting like stretched leather over jagged bones. I didn't run. I couldn't. My feet were lead, my breath shallow. It just watched me, still as death, calculating. Slowly, I stumbled back toward the RV, fumbling for the door with shaking hands. I locked myself inside, knowing it wouldn't matter. The hum didn't stop. It crept inside my skull, buzzing in my teeth, thrumming in my chest. But the creature didn't come for me, not that night. By dawn, I dared to look outside. The engine was wrecked. Torn wires dangled, metal warped as if twisted by invisible hands. No animal could do this. My stomach churned with the truth. Whatever that thing was, it didn't want me leaving. There was no choice. The ranger station was 10 miles away. I packed a map, water, and my knife, then stepped into the forest. The woods were wrong, too quiet. The trees leaned in, heavy with secrets, and every crack of a twig felt like a gunshot. I knew it was watching, just beyond the edge of my sight. And then the hum returned. Not distant this time, close, everywhere. It pressed against my ears, my ribs. I froze as it stepped onto the trail ahead. In daylight, it was worse. A grotesque parody of a wolf, stretched and mangled, with teeth too large for its mouth and legs that bent in ways that defied nature. It stared at me, hunger glinting in its soulless eyes. My knife was laughable against it, but I raised it anyway. The creature hesitated, its head tilting as if recognizing the blade. Then it lunged. I ran, branches clawing at my face, feet pounding through the underbrush. Behind me, its footsteps were steady, deliberate. It wasn't chasing, it was herding, pushing me deeper into its territory. Just as my strength gave out, I stumbled upon an old cabin, broken, forgotten. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and bracing it with a shaky chair. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The silence was suffocating. The door shuddered as it tested the wood. My eyes darted around the cabin, landing on an ancient rifle mounted on the wall. Desperation steadied my hands. I found bullets just as the door gave way. The thing filled the doorway, a living nightmare of sinew and malice. I fired. The shot tore through its chest. It screamed, an unholy sound that churned my stomach. It staggered, bleeding black ichor, but it didn't fall. It lunged, slamming the rifle from my hands. Its claws raked my arms as we grappled, a desperate animal struggle. In a final frantic motion, I drove my knife into its side. The creature spasmed violently, then went still. I sat there shaking as sunlight bled through the trees. When the Rangers found me, I was half mad and trembling. They took my story and filed it under delirium. But they saw the body. They knew. They just wouldn't say. Back in Detroit, I returned to fixing cars. But sometimes late at night, I hear that hum again. And I wonder, did I kill it? Or did it let me go? The first thing you should know is that fear doesn't come easy to me. 10 years as a park ranger in Shenandoah, handling everything from bears to hikers who think the Appalachian Trail is a casual stroll, has seen to that. But last week shattered all of that. The morning was calm, unremarkable. I'd been assigned to patrol a remote stretch of the park to check on an abandoned campsite. Nothing unusual. Hikers get spooked all the time by bears or sudden storms. I didn't think twice about the half-collapsed tent, the scattered gear, or the cold fire pit. Just another mess to clean up. But then I saw the claw marks. They weren't bear marks, too thin, too jagged, like something had carved them with frenzied precision. A call came over my radio, snapping me back to reality. Mason, you out near Alo? Hikers are reporting something big. You see anything? I hadn't, not yet. As I logged the scene and prepared to leave, I heard it, a dragging sound, faint but deliberate, deeper in the woods. Against better judgment, I followed. The farther I went, the heavier the air became, the more I felt eyes on me. But the forest was empty, or so I thought. Then I saw it. At first, it looked like a fallen tree, but closer it was clear, a carcass, mangled and twisted in ways that defied nature. And the tracks circling it, massive, clawed impressions, like something had been toying with its prey. The sound of scraping came behind me. I turned. It was tall, grotesque, its stretched skin taut over a too thin frame, limbs too long, teeth too sharp, eyes too empty. It moved like it didn't belong, like it was wearing the woods as a mask. I ran. Its footsteps crashed behind me, impossibly fast, impossibly close. I don't remember how I found the service road, only that when I stumbled onto it, the noise stopped. I turned. Nothing. Just silence. Back at the station, I tried to explain, but my boss waved it off. Too many long shifts, Mason. Get some rest. But I didn't imagine it. I couldn't. The next day I returned. The campsite was still there, but the carcass? Gone. Only the claw marks remained, and the tracks. I followed them deeper, against every screaming instinct. That's when I found the bones. Human. The dragging sound came again, closer, and then it emerged, smaller this time, hunched, shifting like it didn't know how to stay one shape. It watched me, silent, deliberate. I stood frozen, unable to move, to breathe, until it slipped back into the trees, leaving only its memory behind. A search team later confirmed the bones were human. No one asked questions, no one wanted answers. I've seen it, and I know this. It's still out there, watching, waiting. I've always hated driving at night, the way the darkness clings just beyond the headlights, the silence that feels more like a breath held too long. It gets under my skin. But there I was, gripping the wheel of my creaking old RV, my knuckles bone white, winding through the shadowy roads of northern Minnesota. It was 1985. My life in ruins. A dead-end job, a cramped apartment, and nothing left to lose. I'd hit the road hoping to clear my head, but that night, the road had other plans. The air turned bitter as I drove, seeping into the RV like icy fingers. I needed to stop. When I saw a narrow, overgrown trail, a forgotten logging road vanishing into the trees, I turned in thinking I'd found some solitude. The clearing I parked in wasn't peaceful though. It was too quiet. No insects, no distant rustling, just silence that felt alive, like it was waiting. I ignored the prickle at the back of my neck, killed the engine, and stepped out to stretch. The quiet pressed down, heavier now, as the towering pines loomed like dark sentinels. I cracked a beer and tried to shake off the unease. Then it started. A faint tapping, soft but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it was the wind, but it didn't stop. It was rhythmic like a heartbeat. My own pulse quickened as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the trees. The beam cut jagged shadows into the blackness. The tapping moved, closer, louder, always just behind me. My breath hitched as I spun, catching a glimpse of movement low to the ground. It was fast, darting between the trees. When I swung the light toward it, nothing was there. Then came the smell. Rot, earth, wet decay, thick and choking. I gagged, stumbling forward, my foot catching on something. I fell hard, the flashlight skittering across the dirt to illuminate it. A pile, mangled bodies, deer, coyotes, torn apart and stacked haphazardly. Blood glistened on fresh kills, mixing with the putrid stench of decay. My stomach churned. No animal did this. No natural thing could. Panic surged and I bolted, crashing through the underbrush. The tapping turned to pounding, louder, faster, relentless. I didn't stop until I reached the RV, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I fumbled for a knife, gripping it with trembling hands. Then came the scratching. At first, it was faint, like nails dragging along the metal, then louder, and then a bang. Something heavy slammed against the RV, rocking it. I pressed myself against the wall, knife useless in my grip. When I peeked through the window, I saw it. It crouched low, its limbs unnaturally long, its matted hair hanging in filthy clumps. Its eyes caught the moonlight, hollow, gleaming with malice. It twisted its head toward me with a snap, its neck bending too far. And then it smiled. Not a human smile, not an animal's. This smile was too wide, too sharp, filled with something cruel and hungry. My blood turned to ice. I dropped the knife, scrambled to the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the clearing, branches clawing at the sides as I sped down the trail. But it wasn't over. The RV lurched violently, the steering wheel jerking from my grip. I fought to keep control, but the tires screamed and gave out. When I finally stopped, I stepped out with my rifle, heart pounding. The tires weren't slashed, they were shredded, torn apart by claws that left deep, jagged marks in the metal. A chill ran down my spine. Then behind me a rustle. I spun, rifle raised, but the forest was still. Too still. Then I felt it, hot, rancid breath brushing against my neck. I turned slowly, it was there. Towering over me, its grin impossibly wide, its claws hanging like scythes. Mud and blood dripped from its hair, and its breath reeked of rot. My hands shook as I fired. The shot rang out and the creature staggered, letting out a scream that rattled my bones. I didn't wait. I ran. The RV barely made it to the next town. Tires in shreds, blood smeared along the sides, but I was alive. I don't know what I saw in those woods, and I don't want to. All I know is that sometimes silence isn't empty. Sometimes it watches, sometimes it smiles. The sky sagged under a bruised, oppressive gray as I eased my RV into the secluded clearing at Pine Ridge. The isolation was intentional, a refuge whispered to me by a friend, promising solitude and stillness. What they failed to mention, or perhaps didn't know, was the malevolence festering beneath its calm facade. My name is Milo Hawkins. Life hasn't been kind, and I've clawed my way through its shadows. This trip was supposed to be my escape, a fleeting chance to breathe free of the relentless weight I carry. But Pine Ridge had other plans, plans that would twist a quiet retreat into something far darker. The campsite was silent, unnervingly so. Not peaceful, but hollow. I set up the RV, placed a chair by the fire pit, and cracked open a beer. The forest whispered faintly, a breath of sound that should have soothed, but under the bruised sky, even nature seemed subdued, as though it too was holding its breath. By midday, restlessness drove me to the trails. Pine Ridge was famed for its rugged beauty, and I wanted to see it for myself. Map in hand, I stepped into the shadowed woods. Towering trees formed a canopy that transformed the sunlight into fractured beams, their branches weaving a cathedral of darkness. It felt ancient, almost sacred, until the smell hit me. At first, it was faint, a metallic bite on the breeze. But as I pressed forward, it grew, sharp and rancid, until my stomach churned. Then I saw it. The deer, or what remained of it. Its body lay gutted, flesh torn in a way no natural predator could explain. Blood stained the ground in dark, sticky pools, and its entrails were scattered like a macabre offering. I should have turned back. Every nerve screamed at me to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I took photos, proof for the authorities, or so I told myself. The forest felt darker on the return. The air was heavier, the silence oppressive. And then it began, the feeling of being watched. The sensation clung to me, thick and unrelenting, as I stumbled back to the RV. I forced myself into normalcy, cooking dinner, distracting my mind. But the unease had rooted itself deep. When night fell, it brought with it a suffocating blackness that seemed alive. Just past midnight, the first sound came, a long, deliberate scrape against the RV's side. My breath caught. Clutching a flashlight, I stepped outside. The air was cold, biting. The trees loomed, their shadows writhing in the faint beam of light. Nothing. I told myself it was the wind, but I didn't believe it. Then the power cut out. The RV sank into blackness. My flashlight flickered as I fumbled with the batteries, hands trembling. Then came the sound again. Closer now. A low, guttural thud followed, vibrating through my chest. I armed myself with a hunting knife and stepped into the night. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the dark, landing on him. At the edge of the clearing stood a man, or what looked like one. He was impossibly tall and gaunt, his skin stretched too tight over sharp bones. His clothes hung in tatters, soaked with something dark and wet. But it was his eyes, bottomless pits of black reflecting nothing, that turned my blood to ice. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice weak, betraying me. He didn't answer. He moved instead, fast, impossibly fast, lunging with a snarl that wasn't human. We collided, and his weight drove me to the ground. His hands clawed at my face as I slashed blindly, the knife biting flesh. His strength was monstrous, his movements feral. With a desperate kick, I sent him sprawling, but he rose again, this time wielding a crude club studded with rusted nails. The fight was savage. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting the clearing in a grotesque dance of light and shadow. Blood sprayed, his, mine, and I fought with every ounce of strength I had. When I finally landed a blow that brought him down, he lay still, but his eyes, they never left mine, burning with a hatred that defied reason. I ran, locking myself in the RV and dialing 911. My voice shook as I described the attack. The operator's calm reassurances felt hollow. Minutes stretched into eternity until sirens pierced the night. The police found him where I left him, barely alive. Later, they told me he was a wanted criminal, a drifter responsible for a string of brutal crimes in the area. But they couldn't explain his strength, his speed, or the void-like madness in his eyes. I left Pine Ridge at first light, the once promising haven, now a scar in my memory. As the RV rumbled away, I couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't just a man. Some places don't let you leave entirely. This happened to me on October 18, 1993, somewhere deep in central Arkansas. The road there stretches through woods that seem to close in on you, almost like the trees are waiting to drag you into their darkness. I'd been on the road for years, used to the endless quiet, the only sound being my tires against the pavement. But that night was different. I was hauling lumber from Mississippi to Oklahoma, just a routine trip. My rig, a 1987 Kenworth W900, old reliable, had its quirks. The radio would cut in and out, static crackling like whispers, but that didn't bother me much. The CB was on, but the airwaves were dead, nothing but silence. I was about an hour outside Elmdale when it all started. The first thing I noticed, the radio. No music, just static, and then a high-pitched whine, so sharp it made my ears ring. I slammed the dashboard, hoping it'd stop, but it didn't. I turned it off and focused on the road ahead. Then the darkness hit. The moon had been bright earlier, but now, nothing. The woods once at the edge of the road seemed to lean in closer, twisting and gnarling like skeletal hands reaching for me. My headlights barely cut through the blackness. The road was barely visible, the lines fading into the nothingness. I checked the time, just after midnight, and then I saw it, on the shoulder. At first I thought it was a deer, but no. This thing was tall, too thin. It almost looked human, but something was terribly wrong. Its arms hung long, nearly to its knees, and its head way too big, way too elongated. My heart pounded as I slowed the truck, not wanting to hit it, and as I got closer, it turned its head. Those eyes, two glowing pinpricks, burned into me, cold, unfeeling. It wasn't human. Its face was flat. No nose, just wrong. My gut told me to floor it and get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away. The thing didn't move, just stood there, staring. And then, without warning, it darted into the woods. Not ran, no. It darted, so fast I could barely register it. One moment it was there, the next, swallowed by the trees. I drove on, but something felt off. The woods, they weren't just trees anymore. They were watching me. Every shadow seemed alive, creeping toward me. The headlights flickered, the engine sputtered, and then, just as fast, it roared back to life. That's when I heard it, a low rumble, like something deep beneath the earth. I glanced in my mirrors, but saw only black. My heart raced. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. And then, just as I started to push the gas, I saw it, flickering lights like a fire. I slowed down. There, off the side of the road, an old cabin. It wasn't supposed to be there. It shouldn't have been there. The firelight flickered unnaturally, too bright, too orange. I pulled over against my better judgment. Maybe help? An explanation? I grabbed my flashlight, stepped down from the truck, in the air, heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood, and something else. Something metallic. I walked toward the cabin, the sound of my boots crunching over gravel the only noise. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The cabin was abandoned, yet shadows flickered inside, moving back and forth. My heart pounded, and for a moment I thought of turning back. But I didn't. The door swung open on its own as I reached the porch. Inside, the fire burned brightly, yet the room was empty. The furniture was old, covered in dust, but the fire, that was recent. Someone had been here. Then I heard it, a voice. Help me. Faint, desperate, I froze. It called again, louder this time, more urgent. Help me. I stepped inside, my feet creaking on the wooden floor. The fire cast long shadows on the walls, distorting everything. I followed the voice to a back room. The door was ajar. My hand shook as I pushed it open. The room was dark, the flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. But there, in the center, a figure huddled in the corner. A man, or what used to be. His skin was pale, eyes wide with terror, but his mouth moved, no sound came out. Then something moved behind me. A shadow, tall, too tall. It was there, crouched in the doorway. And those eyes, glowing, unblinking. I stumbled back, reaching for the door, but it was too late. The thing lunged, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I raised my arm, but it slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. My flashlight slid across the floor, leaving me in darkness. I scrambled to my feet. The thing circled me in the shadows, its breath ragged, wet. I backed toward the door, heart pounding, hands searching for the handle. I found it, yanked it open, and bolted down the hall. My boots pounded the floor. The thing was right behind me, its breath on my neck. I slammed the front door open and ran for my truck. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. The creature's howl echoed behind me, sending a chill down my spine. I climbed into the cab, slammed the door, and started the engine. The truck roared to life, tires screeching as I tore down the road, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop hours later. I parked, my hands shaking, my heart still hammering in my chest. I stayed there, engine idling, waiting for the sun to rise. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? Hell, I barely believe it myself, but I know this much. Whatever it was, it's out there, in the woods, watching. And I'll never go back. My name is Garrett Pine. I've never been one to shy away from a challenge. Born in New Orleans, I've always felt an odd connection to the wilderness, despite growing up in a city known for its jazz and nightlife. My father, a former park ranger, taught me to respect the wild. I spent more time in the bayou than on the crowded streets, learning to move through the murky waters and dense trees as though they were my home. By 35, I had settled into a comfortable routine as an IT specialist. Ironic, I know, for someone who craved the outdoors. But my job was remote, so I could escape whenever the urge struck. That's how I found myself planning a solo RV trip through the vast wilderness of Maine, a place I'd always longed to visit but never had. After years of saving, I finally bought my RV, a compact, well-equipped home on wheels, ready to take me into the unknown. It was meant to be a break, a chance to disconnect and rediscover something simpler. What I didn't know was that it would lead me into a nightmare. I set out in late August, the air crisp with the first chill of autumn. My destination was the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, a vast, untamed forest in northern Maine, known for its isolation and rugged beauty, perfect. After days of driving, I arrived. The spot was ideal. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a narrow trail leading to a crystal-clear lake. The isolation was comforting, a silence so deep it filled the air. The first night passed without incident. I set up camp, cooked a simple dinner, and fell asleep to the soft rustling of the trees. But on the second night, everything changed. It started with a hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames when I first heard it. Distant at first, almost too faint to catch. Then it grew louder, closer, vibrating through the air and my bones. I doused the fire and sat still, straining to listen. It wasn't the hum of an engine or an animal. It was something else, something unnatural. The forest, once alive with crickets and owls, fell into an eerie silence. The hum continued, steady and unrelenting, until it abruptly stopped. And with it, the silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed down on me, heavy, like something was waiting just beyond the edge of the trees. Frozen, I stared into the dark woods, expecting something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The noise didn't return, and after what felt like hours, I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe some distant machinery. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I tried to shake the unease. I hiked the trail, the sunlight filtering through the canopy, casting soft shadows on the ground. But the beauty of the forest felt wrong. There was a presence, a watching that I couldn't shake. I didn't see any wildlife, no birds, no squirrels, just silence. The air itself felt thick, oppressive. As I walked back to camp, I noticed something unsettling. The trees seemed closer, the path narrower. It was as if the forest was subtly pushing me towards something, an irrational thought, but the anxiety gnawing at me made it feel far too real. By nightfall, the anxiety had turned to full-blown panic. I tried to push it away, keeping myself busy with trivial tasks, gathering firewood, checking supplies, but that feeling lingered, that sense that I wasn't alone. That night, the hum returned, louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like a presence. The fire crackled before me, but its warmth did nothing to chase the dread from my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. But there was nothing, only the endless blackness of the forest. I didn't sleep. The hum faded, but the silence that followed was worse, thick and suffocating. Every creak of the RV sounded like a warning. I sat, frozen in the driver's seat, keys in hand, ready to flee at the slightest sound. But something kept me there. Stubbornness, maybe. Maybe fear of what would happen if I left. At dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up camp, eager to escape. But as I secured my gear, something made me stop. In the soft earth around my RV, there were tracks, massive, deep claw marks. Each print was so large, so impossibly heavy that my heart sank. The stride was long, too long, far longer than anything I knew of in the woods. Panic gripped me. My hands trembled as I loaded my things into the RV, ignoring the horrifying proximity of whatever had been stalking me. I started the engine, my heart hammering, and sped down the winding road, shadows between the trees seeming to hide things that waited for me. The hum returned, faint at first, then growing stronger. It was following me. I could feel it, pulsing, vibrating in my bones. I didn't stop until I reached Milano, a quiet town far from the wilderness. I parked in front of a diner, too rattled to think straight. Inside, I ordered coffee, my hands still trembling. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, noticed my distress. She asked if I was okay, and before I knew it, I told her everything. The hum, the silence, the tracks. She listened, but her expression changed. She leaned in, speaking in a hushed tone. "You're not the first," she whispered, glancing around. "People talk about the Allagash. Strange things happen in those woods, things that don't make sense." I wanted to ask more, but something in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't a warning. It was something darker. "Get out of town," she said, voice trembling. "Put as much distance between yourself and those woods as you can." I didn't need to be told twice. I paid for my coffee and left. I didn't look back, and I never spoke of it again. The tracks, those deep, heavy prints, they haunt me. Whatever made them was real, and it was close, too close. Now I'm back in New Orleans, in the comfort of my apartment, but the peace I hoped to find in those woods is gone. The hum still echoes in my mind sometimes, a reminder that some things shouldn't be understood. Some things hide in the dark corners of the world, waiting. I still love the outdoors, but now I stay where there are people, where there's light. It's a small price to pay for peace of mind. If you ever find yourself in Maine, do yourself a favor, stay away from the Allagash. Some things are better left unseen. It's strange how I ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, doing something I promised myself I'd never do. You see, I've always been a city person, drawn to the constant hum of traffic, the comforting glow of streetlights, and the simple peace of knowing a bodega is just around the corner. My name is Arthur Mvin, and I used to be an investment banker, someone who worked relentlessly, never pausing for a break, until one day I was forced to. The heart attack wasn't fatal, but it was enough to make my doctor insist on some time away from the office. So, after some soul searching and pressure from my family, I bought an RV and hit the road, hoping to find peace in nature. I thought camping might help. Maybe. And that's how I ended up here, in the deep woods of West Virginia, far from anything civilized. Monongahela National Forest. The name itself was a tongue twister, let alone something to appreciate. The forest was vast, dense, and eerily still, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. At first it was peaceful. The air was crisp, the trees were giants, and the sky, when it peeked through the canopy, was an unsettling shade of blue, blue I hadn't seen in years. I parked the RV by a small stream, far enough from the usual campsites to avoid any intrusion. I wanted isolation, and isolation is what I got. The first day passed quietly enough. I hiked a little, read a book, tried to fish, but failed miserably. As the sun began to set, I made a fire, cooked some beans, and almost enjoyed the rustic simplicity, almost. Night came quickly, and with it a silence so deep it pressed on my ears. The kind of silence that makes you feel like your own thoughts are screaming at you. I was just about to turn in when I heard it, a faint rustling from the trees. I told myself it was just a deer or some other harmless animal, but then it grew closer, heavier. Something big moving through the brush. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed into the darkness, but all I saw were shadows, faint glints of light off the leaves. The rustling stopped. I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the RV door, checked it twice, and went to bed, feeling a little silly for being so spooked. The next day, I decided to hike further from the campsite, exploring some of the less traveled trails. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and set out, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in my gut. The trail barely resembled a path, more like a suggestion, winding through dense trees and over rocky terrain. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was absurd. There was no one out here, no signs of other campers, just me and the woods. After about an hour, I stumbled upon something strange, a perfect circular clearing, like the trees had been cut down intentionally. In the center, a stone structure, moss-covered and low to the ground. It looked ancient, like an altar or shrine, forgotten maybe, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Curiosity pulled me in, and as I reached out to touch one of the stones, I heard it again. The rustling. But this time, there was a rhythmic thumping too, like something heavy hitting the ground. I turned, expecting to see another hiker, or maybe an animal, but there was nothing. The clearing stood silent, the trees watching like silent sentinels. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving me standing in that unsettling circle, heart racing. I turned back toward the RV, walking faster than I cared to admit. When I arrived, everything seemed untouched, just as I left it. But the feeling of being watched, it only grew stronger. It never left. As dusk settled, I started another fire, hoping for comfort. But the night felt darker, thicker. I heard the rustling again, closer now, and the thumping, growing nearer with each beat. I couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong. I locked myself in the RV again, knife in hand. And then it happened. The RV shook. Not a gentle tremor, but a violent jolt, as if something had slammed into it. I froze, gripping the knife, waiting. Then the second impact came, harder, accompanied by a screech that made my blood run cold. I couldn't sit there, waiting for whatever it was to break in. I had to do something. But what? The creature, it had to be a creature, slammed into the RV again and again, shaking the metal, creaking under the force. I couldn't stay in there. I couldn't. I opened the door and bolted, knife in hand, running into the dark toward the only place I knew, the clearing. The night was pitch black, the moon swallowed by clouds, and all I could hear was the thumping, the rustling, the breath behind me. Something was chasing me. I reached the clearing, right, my heart pounding. And then silence, thick, suffocating silence. And then from the shadows it appeared, a hulking figure covered in fur, standing on two legs, its face wrong like a twisted wolf, its eyes, those eyes wild, unblinking, reflecting the faint moonlight. It stepped forward and I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. The creature snarled, a deep guttural sound that shook the ground beneath me. I knew I couldn't fight it, not with just a knife. There was nowhere to run. The creature lunged, moving faster than something so large should, knocking me to the ground. I struggled, slashing wildly, the knife barely grazing its hide, the weight of it pressing down, its jaws snapping near my throat. I was going to die here, wasn't I? In a desperate burst of adrenaline, I grabbed a rock and smashed it against the creature's head. It recoiled and I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the knife. Without thinking, I charged, driving the blade into its side. Blood, dark and thick, poured from the wound, staining my hands. The creature howled, thrashing, but I held on, plunging the knife deeper. Finally, with a shuddering breath, it collapsed. I stood there, panting, my hands shaking, staring at the lifeless body at my feet. For a moment, I couldn't believe it was over, that I had survived. The silence settled again, heavy and oppressive. I stumbled back to the RV, covered in blood, and sat there, my mind numb. The night stretched on, but I couldn't feel anything, except exhaustion. I knew I had to leave, but first I needed to make sure it was real. I walked back to the clearing, half expecting the creature's body to be gone, for the nightmare to slip away, but when I got there, I saw nothing, nothing but the trees, watching. I was out camping in an old RV I had picked up cheap. Thought I'd spend a few days deep in the woods, just me and my dog, Rusty. He's a big German shepherd, loyal and protective. We parked by a lake, far from any towns or highways. The first few days were fine. I'd fish in the morning, read a book, take Rusty for walks around the lake. It was peaceful, the kind of silence you don't get in the city. Just the wind in the trees, the water gently lapping at the shore, the occasional bird call. It felt safe. But on the third day, I met a couple of campers, Mike and Jenna. They were friendly enough, set up in a tent a little further down the lake. We swapped stories, shared a beer or two, laughing about how perfect it was to be so far from the world. They seemed like good people, maybe in their early 30s, just out to enjoy the outdoors. That night, things started to change. I was sitting by the fire, Rusty curled up at my feet, when I heard a strange rustling from the woods. It was off. Something about it felt wrong. Rusty growled low, his ears perked, his eyes locked on the darkness. I figured it was probably just a raccoon or some animal, but Rusty wouldn't calm down. He kept growling and barking, staring into the night. It made me uneasy, but I brushed it off until it didn't stop. That feeling, it didn't sit right. I decided to call it a night and went inside the RV, locking the door behind me. Rusty stayed by the window watching. The next morning I found tracks, big ones, around the campsite, bigger than anything I'd ever seen and not from any animal I recognized. They weren't bear tracks, no. They looked almost human, too big with long, claw-like marks. I showed them to Mike and Jenna when they stopped by. We laughed about it, joked about Bigfoot, but there was this tension in the air. That evening, Mike and Jenna came over again, and we sat around the fire. Then we heard it, a scream from across the lake, distant, blood-curdling. Rusty went wild, barking, straining at his leash. Mike and I grabbed flashlights, deciding to check it out, leaving Jenna with Rusty. We walked through the woods, the air growing colder. A heavy silence descended. No birds, no crickets, just our footsteps crunching through the leaves. When we reached the other side of the lake, there was nothing. No signs of anyone, just the lake, the trees, and that thick, that unnerving silence. We headed back, and the whole time I felt watched. When we returned, Jenna was pale. Rusty was barking frantically at something in the woods. She said she saw something. No, someone, moving fast between the trees. A shadow, big and fast. We decided to stay awake, taking turns on watch. I took the first shift, sitting by the fire with Rusty beside me. The hours crawled by until finally I saw it, eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. They were too high off the ground to be any animal I knew. They stared, unblinking. Then they vanished. I woke Mike and Jenna, and we huddled together, armed with a knife, a baseball bat, and a heavy flashlight. The night dragged on. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made us jump. By morning, we were all drained. It was clear we weren't safe. We needed to leave. As we packed up, I noticed Rusty was gone. His leash was snapped, and tracks led into the woods. My heart sank. I grabbed my knife and rushed into the trees, Mike and Jenna right behind me. We called for Rusty, but the woods swallowed our voices. Then we found him, or what was left of him. His body, torn apart, scattered through the woods. It was something out of a nightmare. My blood ran cold. This wasn't the work of any animal. It was something else, something not natural. We didn't stay. We ran, packed up, and left. The drive back was silent. When we reached the nearest town, we told the authorities, but they didn't believe us. A bear, a cougar, they said. Something that could be explained. But I knew better. Whatever was in those woods was no ordinary animal. It wasn't natural. Weeks later, I got a call from Jenna. Mike was missing. He'd gone back to the lake, trying to figure out what had really happened. They found his car, abandoned, but no sign of him. I didn't blame her for being scared. I was terrified too. I never went back to that place. I sold the RV, moved far away, tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I think of those eyes in the darkness and I wonder, is it still out there? Waiting? People like to talk about urban legends, things that go bump in the night. Most of it's just stories, but sometimes those stories are true. There's always a little truth behind the legend. I never found out what that thing was, and maybe it's better that way. Mike's disappearance was never solved. The authorities said he got lost, wandered into the wilderness. But I know it was something else, something we don't understand. The locals have names for it, wisp, they call it. It's just a word, but it's enough to keep me up at night. So if you ever find yourself by a quiet lake in the middle of nowhere, remember my story. Because the quiet places, they're the ones you should be afraid of. And if you see eyes in the dark, don't wait to see what they belong to. Don't look back. Just run and never look back. I used to think ghost stories were just myths, tales spun around campfires, the stuff of overactive imaginations fueled by the dark. Mark, my boyfriend, used to tease me about it, finding amusement in my skepticism. He called it grounding. But now I don't know what to believe. Not after Devil's Basin. Not after her. If this account somehow finds its way to someone, if Mark and I vanish like those before us, swallowed by the desert, I need someone to know. Maybe it sounds insane, but it's the only thing keeping me sane. My name is Amber Connors. Until last week, I was just another young woman trying to escape the grind of city life. Mark and I planned a getaway, a quiet, peaceful weekend in the Nevada desert. Devil's Basin was supposed to be perfect, remote, isolated, with nothing but endless skies and the two of us. We passed through a ghost town before reaching the basin, a crumbling relic from the 50s with peeling paint and an old man squinting from a rocking chair. Mark made some joke about stepping into the past, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching us, his eyes following our RV as though he knew something we didn't. The road to the basin was rough, but Mark loved it. He grinned the whole way, his sunglasses reflecting the jagged red rocks as he declared, "This is it. No one's gonna find us here." The first day was everything we wanted. Burgers on the grill, cold beers, endless skies. That night, the stars burned brighter than I'd ever seen, like 1,000 tiny eyes watching us from the heavens. I didn't know then how soon the watching would start. On the second night, I woke around midnight. The desert was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that gnaws at your nerves. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and that's when I saw her. Far off, beyond the glow of our camp, stood a figure, a woman or something that looked like one. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a cactus or a rock in the distance. But then she moved, slow, deliberate, gliding toward us as though she didn't walk but floated. Her skin, if that's what it was, gleamed pale under the faint moonlight, like sun-bleached bone. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I darted inside the RV, locking the door behind me. Mark stirred, but I told him it was nothing, just my imagination. The next morning, I knew it hadn't been. There were faint handprints on the windows, long skeletal shapes that shimmered in the weak light of dawn. Mark brushed them off as dust, maybe condensation, but they were too precise, too deliberate. That night, the air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest, suffocating. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, watching. Around midnight, I woke again, this time to a sound, a whisper, distorted and faint, like someone speaking underwater. I held my breath, straining to hear, and Mark shot up beside me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We stepped outside with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. There she was, closer this time. Her face was impossibly thin, hollow eyes like black voids. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, lips moving, but all I could hear was a garbled hiss. Mark shouted at her to leave, but she didn't react. Her head tilted, studying us like we were prey. Then she took one slow, gliding step forward. I yanked Mark back into the RV, slamming the door and locking it. The engine roared to life, then sputtered and died. Mark tried again, but the RV remained still, useless. Outside, the whispers grew louder, crawling under my skin, swirling around us. Shadows moved across the windows, skeletal hands pressing against the glass, leaving ghostly, glowing prints. She was testing the barrier, searching for a way in. The hours bled together, marked only by the tapping on the windows and that relentless, distorted whispering. Mark tried to stay calm, but I could see the cracks forming in him, his bravado crumbling. When the sun finally rose, the whispers stopped. The windows and walls were smeared with hundreds of glowing handprints. The air stank of rot. In the distance, I saw her retreating into the desert, a malevolent figure fading into the horizon. This time, the engine started, and we didn't stop until we were miles away from that cursed place. But we didn't escape. It's been 3 days since we got back, and I still hear her whispers at night, just outside the window. Mark isn't the same. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't eat. Last night, I woke to find him standing by the window, staring into the void. "What are you doing?" I asked, trembling. He turned slowly, his eyes hollow, and smiled a smile that wasn't his. "She's coming," he whispered. "I don't think we'll outrun her. Not ever." In the summer of 2018, I sought refuge from the chaos of city life, deciding to spend a week alone at Glacier National Park in Montana. I thought some solitude might be good for me, trading the noise of the city for the whispers of the forest. I arrived on a bright Tuesday afternoon, the towering mountains looming like ancient guardians, their snow-covered peaks sparkling under the sun. The air was crisp, sharp, and cool. A stream nearby glistened. The spot I parked my RV in could have been plucked from a postcard, so serene it almost felt too perfect. A few hundred yards away, another RV stood, with a middle-aged couple outside waving. They seemed friendly enough, so I waved back, relieved that maybe I wouldn't be entirely alone out here. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked a nearby trail, inhaling the fresh pine scent. A deer grazed nearby, lifting its head to stare at me before returning to its meal. I almost took a picture, but something about the moment felt fragile, like capturing it would ruin it. Back at my campsite, I struggled to start a fire, but finally managed. Proud of my small victory, I heated up some canned beans, gourmet wilderness cuisine. As dusk descended, Linda and Mark invited me for a drink. Their fire crackled warmly, and we shared stories, passing around a bottle of whiskey. Mark's joke about a bear walking into a bar was dreadful, but we laughed anyway. Whether from the alcohol or something else, I couldn't tell. At 10 p.m., I thanked them and made my way back to my RV. The night was breathtaking. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds, their brilliance untainted by city lights. I fell asleep, feeling a rare sense of peace. That peace didn't last. A rustling outside woke me in the dead of night. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but there was something unsettling about it. Too deliberate, too close. The next morning, I decided to check on Linda and Mark. I walked to their campsite, expecting the usual morning bustle, but their RV door was wide open. "Linda? Mark?" I called. No answer. Inside, the RV was in disarray. Chairs overturned, belongings strewn about. The air was thick, oppressive, like the space itself recoiled from whatever had transpired inside. My stomach turned. I rushed outside and began searching. About 50 yards into the woods, I saw it. A smear of red on a tree trunk. Blood. Against every instinct screaming at me to flee, I followed the trail. The blood smears led me deeper into the forest, to a clearing where I found Mark, or what remained of him. His body lay twisted, broken, deep gashes carving grotesque patterns across his chest. His face wasn't a face anymore. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. This was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, not a nightmare. I thought of Linda. If she was still alive, I had to find her. The forest closed in around me, every shadow a threat. Then a faint, muffled cry, coming from ahead. I crept forward and entered another clearing. My breath caught in my throat. Linda was tied to a tree, gagged, thrashing in desperation. A man stood over her, tall and wiry, clothes torn and filthy. His hair hung in tangled clumps. He held a hunting knife. I had nothing, no weapon. My hands trembled as I grabbed a fallen branch, my only chance. "Hey!" I shouted, charging into the clearing. He turned, his eyes wild, hollow, unnatural. I swung the branch with all my strength, hitting his arm. The knife dropped. "Run!" I shouted to Linda, fumbling with her ropes. The man lunged at me, tackling me to the ground, his hands closing around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. Desperate, I clawed at his face, jamming my thumb into his eye. He howled, releasing me. Linda freed herself and grabbed the knife. She tossed it to me just as the man lunged again. This time I was ready. I sidestepped and slashed at him, the blade cutting across his arm. Blood sprayed, but he barely flinched. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "Get help!" I screamed at Linda. She hesitated, then bolted into the forest. The man grinned. "Just you and me now." We circled each other, my hands trembling but gripping the knife tightly. He lunged. We tumbled to the ground, wrestling for control. His hands found my throat again, squeezing tighter. My vision blurred, black spots dancing in front of my eyes. I felt something, a rock beneath my fingers. With all my strength, I slammed it into his skull. Once, twice. He grunted, rolling off me, clutching his head. I didn't wait. I ran. Branches scraped at my skin, but I didn't stop until I saw it, the ranger station. Linda was pounding on the door, screaming for help. A park ranger stepped out, his hand already on his gun. "There's a man! He killed someone!" Linda cried. Before she could finish, the man emerged from the woods, eyes gleaming with fury. "Stop!" the ranger ordered. The man didn't listen. The first shot hit the ground, a warning. The second struck his leg, and the third hit his chest. He fell, motionless. The ranger approached cautiously, gun still raised. "Daniel Harper," he muttered. "Used to be a guide, lost his mind after his family died. He's been out here ever since." By the time the authorities arrived, it felt like years had passed. Mark's body was recovered. Statements were taken. As I packed up my RV, Linda turned to me. "Thank you," she said softly. I forced a smile. "Next time, I'll camp somewhere with Wi-Fi." She laughed, but her eyes were haunted. So were mine. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the mountains, standing silent as ever, witnesses to everything, their beauty forever marred.